A scream pierces the stillness of Marwood Hall, a grand estate cloaked in mist and secrets. A valet lies dead, poisoned, with a single word scrawled beside him: traitor. Who betrayed whom in this house of hidden motives? Was it the financier with a missing letter? The actress with her evasive glances? Or the scholar whose trembling hands betray more than fear? As suspicion tightens its grip, one question burns. Who among the glittering guests is a murderer, and what dark truth are they desperate to conceal? In a world where every smile hides a lie, Miss Jane Marple's quiet eyes see all. Will she unravel the deadly web before another falls? Chapter 1. The Invitation to Marwood Hall. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the days unfolded with the gentle predictability of a well-wound clock, Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. A faint breeze carried the scent of roses from her garden, mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed tea. It was a scene of such serene domesticity that one might have overlooked the sharp glint in Miss Marple's eyes, a sign that her mind was never truly at rest. On the table beside her lay an envelope, its crisp edges slightly yellowed, addressed in a precise, elegant hand. The letter had arrived that morning, an unexpected intrusion into her tranquil routine. It was an invitation from Lady Beatrice Ashford, mistress of Marwood Hall, a grand estate some miles distant, nestled in the rolling hills of Devon. Lady Beatrice, a widow of considerable wealth and impeccable reputation, was hosting a weekend gathering to celebrate the engagement of her niece, Clara Ashford, to a dashing young barrister named Lawrence Cavendish. The guest list, as outlined in the letter, promised a constellation of notable figures: a retired colonel, a celebrated actress, a reclusive scholar, and a financier with a shadowed past. Miss Marple's inclusion, though flattering, was curious. She was, after all, a spinster of modest means, known more for her quiet wisdom than her social standing. "Why me?" Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing as she gazed at the letter. "Beatrice Ashford is no fool. She knows I am not one for idle chatter or grand soirees. There is something afoot, I think." Her suspicions were not without foundation. Lady Beatrice, though a pillar of decorum, was rumored to have a knack for uncovering secrets. Her invitation hinted at more than a mere celebration. "Your presence," the letter read, "would bring me great comfort in these delicate times." Delicate times. The phrase lingered in Miss Marple's certified mind like a half-forgotten tune. As she sipped her tea, her thoughts drifted to sprawling grounds that seemed to whisper of forgotten scandals. Its isolation, far from the prying eyes of the village, made it the perfect stage for a drama or a tragedy. The clock on the mantel chimed 5, pulling her from her reverie. She set aside her knitting and rose, her movements precise despite her advancing years. If Lady Beatrice required her presence, Miss Marple would oblige, but not without her wits sharpened and her eyes open. She had long ago learned that beneath the veneer of politeness, human nature often hid its darkest impulses. The journey to Marwood Hall was uneventful, though the late autumn landscape, with its golden leaves and lengthening shadows, seemed to mirror the undercurrent of unease in Miss Marple's mind. She arrived at dusk on Friday, her modest suitcase carried by a young footman who greeted her with a nervous smile. The hall loomed before her, its stone facade softened by ivy, its windows glowing with the promise of warmth. Yet there was something in the air, a chill that had little to do with the weather. Lady Beatrice welcomed her in the grand entrance hall, her silver hair gleaming under the chandelier. She was a tall woman, her posture regal, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of anxiety. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come," she said, her voice warm but measured. I trust the journey was not too taxing." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her smile gentle but her gaze keen. "Your invitation was most kind. I look forward to meeting your guests." The drawing room was already alive with conversation when they entered. Clara Ashford, the bride-to-be, was a vision of youthful beauty, her auburn hair pinned elegantly, her laughter bright but tinged with nervousness. Lawrence Cavendish, her fiancé, stood at her side, his charm as polished as his cufflinks, though Miss Marple noted a certain restlessness in his movements. The other guests were equally intriguing. Colonel Reginald Hargreaves, a retired military man with a booming voice and a penchant for whiskey, held court by the fireplace. Miss Evelyn Durant, a stage actress whose star had dimmed but whose charisma had not, sipped champagne with a knowing smile. Dr. Percival Gray, a scholar of obscure manuscripts, sat quietly in a corner, his eyes darting about as if cataloguing the room. And then there was Mr. Victor Langston, a financier whose wealth was matched only by the whispers of his dubious dealings in the city. As Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from a maid, she observed the group with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying a specimen. The laughter was too loud, the glances too guarded. Beneath the polished surface of this gathering, something simmered, a tension as palpable as the crackle of the fire. Dinner was a lavish affair. Served in a dining room, attention was drawn to small details. Clara's hesitation when asked about her wedding plans. Lawrence's quick glance at Victor Langston when the topic of money arose, and the way Dr. Gray's hand trembled as he reached for his wineglass. As the meal drew to a close, Lady Beatrice rose, her expression grave. "My friends," she said, "I have invited you here not only to celebrate Clara's happiness, but to address a matter of some delicacy. I have reason to believe that one among us harbors a secret that threatens this house." A hush fell over the table. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her teacup steady in her hand. The stage was set, and the curtain had risen on a mystery she was determined to unravel. Chapter 2. The Shadow Falls. The silence that followed Lady Beatrice's pronouncement hung heavy in the dining room of Marwood Hall, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the autumn wind against the windows. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their faces a gallery of guarded expressions. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the end of the table, sipped her tea, her eyes flitting from one guest to another, cataloguing their reactions with the precision of a watchmaker. Colonel Hargreaves coughed into his napkin, his ruddy cheeks flushing deeper. Miss Evelyn Durant's smile tightened, her fingers curling around the stem of her champagne flute. Dr. Percival Gray's gaze dropped to his plate, while Victor Langston leaned back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp as flints. Clara Ashford clutched Lawrence Cavendish's hand, her knuckles whitening, and Lawrence himself gave a forced chuckle, murmuring something about dramatic flair. Lady Beatrice, standing at the head of the table, allowed the silence to linger a moment longer before continuing. "I do not speak lightly," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of strain. "There have been incidents. Letters, anonymous and threatening, delivered to this house. They speak of betrayal, of secrets that could ruin us all. I had hoped this weekend would be a joyous occasion, but I fear we cannot ignore what festers beneath." Miss Marple noted the careful wording. Us all. Did Lady Beatrice include herself in this web of suspicion? Or was she merely casting a net to see who flinched? The old lady's fingers rested lightly on her teacup, her face serene, but her mind was already threading together the first strands of the puzzle. Before anyone could respond, a piercing scream shattered the tension. It came from the direction of the servants' quarters, echoing through the oak-panelled walls. The guests froze, chairs scraping as they turned toward the sound. Lady Beatrice's composure faltered, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "What in heaven's name?" she began. But the door to the dining room burst open, and a young maid, her face pale, hands trembling. He's dead, ma'am. In the servants' hall, on the floor." A collective gasp rose from the table. Victor Langston shot to his feet, his chair toppling backwards. "Dead! Thompson! Impossible!" His voice was sharp, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of something else in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. Lady Beatrice regained her poise with remarkable speed. "Calm yourself, Mr. Langston. We must see to this at once." She turned to the maid. "Mary, fetch Dr. Gray, and show us the way. The rest of you, please remain here." But Miss Marple, with a quiet determination that belied her frail appearance, rose from her seat. "If I may, Lady Beatrice," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I have some experience in such matters. I would like to accompany you." Lady Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, Miss Marple. Your presence may be illuminating." The servants' hall was a stark contrast to the opulence of the main house, its stone floor and plain wooden table lit by a single flickering lamp. On the floor, sprawled in an unnatural pose, lay a man in a dark suit. Thompson, Victor Langston's valet. His face was contorted in a grimace of agony, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. A faint smell of bitter almonds hung in the air, unmistakable to Miss Marple's keen senses. Poison, she thought, her heart sinking. Cyanide, most likely. Dr. Gray knelt beside the body, his scholarly demeanor replaced by a brisk efficiency. "He's been dead no more than an hour," he said, his voice low. "The rigidity hasn't fully set in. And this smell, it's cyanide, I'm certain." Victor Langston, who had insisted on following despite Lady Beatrice's protests, stood in the doorway, his face ashen. "Cyanide? But how? Thompson was perfectly well at dinner. He excused himself to attend to my correspondence." Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting the half-empty glass of water on the table, the overturned chair, and a small, crumpled piece of paper near Thompson's hand. She stepped forward, careful not to disturb the scene, and peered at the paper. It bore a single word, scrawled in hasty ink. "Traitor." "Curious," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She straightened, her gaze settling on the glass. "Dr. Gray, might the poison have been in the water?" "Possibly," he replied, frowning. "Though we'd need to test it. Cyanide acts quickly, within minutes, if ingested in sufficient quantity." Lady Beatrice, her face pale but composed, turned to the maid. "Mary, who else was in this part of the house tonight?" Mary wrung her hands. "Quarters. Its door, just visible down the dim corridor. A convenient excuse, or a genuine errand." "We must call the police," Lady Beatrice said, a voice firm. "This is no accident." Miss Marple nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. The anonymous letters, the word traitor, the sudden death of a man who served a financier with a questionable reputation. It was a tapestry of motives and secrets, and she was determined to unravel it. As they returned to the dining room to await the authorities, she observed Victor Langston closely. His shock seemed genuine, but there was a hardness in his eyes, a calculation that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. The other guests, still gathered around the table, erupted into questions as Lady Beatrice recounted the grim discovery. Colonel Hargreaves blustered about damned foul play, while Miss Durrant's theatrical gasp drew every eye. Clara clung to Lawrence, her face buried in his shoulder, and Dr. Gray resumed his quiet observation, though his fingers twitched nervously. Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting retrieved from her bag. The needles resumed their rhythmic dance, but her mind was far from idle. A man was dead, a clue had been left, and a shadow had fallen over Marwood Hall. The game, as she often thought of such matters, had begun. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Suspicion. The dining room at Marwood Hall, so recently alight with the clink of crystal and the hum of polite conversation, now simmered with a different energy, a restless, electric unease. The guests, confined to the room by Lady Beatrice's firm instruction, shifted in their seats, their faces a mosaic of shock, fear, and thinly veiled suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her knitting in her lap, appeared the very picture of calm, her needles moving with a steady rhythm. Yet her eyes, sharp and bright as a bird's, missed nothing. The way Colonel Hargreaves's fingers drummed on the table, the way Miss Evelyn Durant's gaze lingered on Victor Langston, the way Clara Ashford's hands trembled as she clutched a handkerchief, all were threads in the tapestry she was beginning to weave. Lady Beatrice had dispatched a footman to summon the local police, and the distant wail of a siren now pierced the night, signaling their approach. The news of Thompson's death had spread like wildfire among the staff, and whispers drifted through the walls, carried by anxious maids and grim-faced butlers. Miss Marple noted the absence of Victor Langston, who had been permitted to step out briefly to speak with the butler about his valet's belongings. His absence, though brief, was conspicuous, and she wondered what he might be doing in those unguarded moments. The door opened, admitting a gust of cold air and the figure of Inspector Harrow. A sturdy man with a weathered face and eyes were alert, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. Behind him followed a young constable, notebook in hand, looking faintly overwhelmed by the grandeur of Marwood Hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector Harrow began, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. "I understand this is a distressing evening. I'll need to speak with each of you in turn, but first, I'd like to see the scene of the crime. Lady Beatrice, if you'd be so kind." Lady Beatrice nodded, her composure a bulwark against the chaos. "Of course, Inspector. Miss Marple, Dr. Gray, will you join us? Your observations may be useful." Miss Marple inclined her head, setting aside her knitting with deliberate care. "I am at your service," she said softly, though her mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of the evening. The servants' hall was as they had left it, the air still heavy with the acrid scent of cyanide. Thompson's body remained untouched, his contorted features a stark reminder of the violence that had intruded upon the house. Inspector Harrow knelt beside the body, his expression grim as he examined the scene. "Cyanide, you say, Dr. Gray?" he asked, glancing at the scholar. "Undoubtedly," Dr. Gray replied, his voice steady but his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "The smell is unmistakable and the symptoms, convulsions, rapid death, are consistent." Harrow's gaze fell on the glass of water, still half full on the table. "And this, you think it was the vehicle?" "Possibly," Dr. Gray said, "though we'll need a proper analysis." Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, pointed delicately at the crumpled paper near Thompson's hand. "Inspector, you may wish to examine this. It appears to be a note." Harrow retrieved the paper with a gloved hand, unfolding it to reveal the single word, "traitor." His brow furrowed. "Odd thing to leave behind. Any idea what it means, Lady Beatrice?" Lady Beatrice shook her head, though her eyes flickered with unease. "I cannot say, Inspector, but it aligns with the anonymous letters I mentioned earlier. They, too, spoke of betrayal." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The word traitor was a deliberate clue, she was certain. But whether it was left by the killer or the victim remained unclear. And a small detail, but in her experience, small details were the hinges upon which great mysteries turned. As they returned to the dining room, Inspector Harrow addressed the assembled guests. "I'll need statements from everyone present. Let's start with the timeline. Who saw Mr. Thompson last, and when?" Victor Langston, who had rejoined the group, spoke first. "Thompson was with me in my room. Further need of him during dinner. That was the last I saw of him." "And what time was that, Mr. Langston?" Harrow asked, his pencil poised over his notebook. "About 8 o'clock, Langston replied, his voice steady, but his eyes avoiding the inspector's. "Dinner was just beginning." Miss Marple noted the time. Dinner had started at 8, and the scream had come at approximately 9:30. A narrow window for murder, but not impossible. She turned her attention to Lawrence Cavendish, recalling the maid's mention of his presence near the servants' quarters. "Mr. Cavendish," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "I believe you were in the library earlier this evening, were you not?" Lawrence started, his charming smile faltering for a moment. "Why, yes, Miss Marple. I was looking for a book, a legal text I thought might be useful for a case I'm preparing. I didn't see Thompson, though." "And what time was that?" Inspector Harrow interjected, his tone sharper. "Oh, around 8:15, I suppose," Lawrence said, his fingers brushing nervously against his cufflinks. "I wasn't there long." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. The library was a mere stone's throw from the servants' hall, and the timing placed Lawrence in dangerous proximity to the crime. Yet his manner, though nervous, seemed genuine. Or was it the practiced ease of a barrister, accustomed to masking his true thoughts? As Harrow continued his questioning, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, sifting through the alibis. Colonel Hargreaves claimed to have been in the smoking room alone, nursing a whiskey. Miss Durant said she had lingered in the drawing room, practicing lines for a potential new role. Clara Ashford had been with her aunt, discussing wedding plans, while Dr. Gray had been in his room, reading until summoned to dinner. Each alibi was plausible, yet none was airtight, and Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay in the gaps between words. The inspector, satisfied for the moment, dismissed the guests to their rooms, cautioning them to remain on the estate. As Miss Marple made her way to her guest chamber, she paused in the corridor, her eyes drawn to a small side table where a vase of roses stood. One petal lay on the table, slightly crushed, as if someone had brushed past in haste. She bent to examine it, her fingers hovering but not touching. A trivial thing, perhaps, but in the quiet of Marwood Hall, every detail whispered of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 4. The Questions Begin. The morning after Thompson's death dawned gray and heavy, the sky over Marwood Hall cloaked in a mist that seemed to mirror the unease within its walls. Breakfast was a subdued affair, the clatter of cutlery muted by the weight of the previous night's tragedy.
A cup of tea and a slice of toast. Observed the group with her characteristic quiet intensity. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, untouched for now, as her eyes moved from one face to another, noting the subtle shifts in demeanor. Inspector Harrow had returned at first light, accompanied by his young constable and a forensic expert from the county police. The servants' hall had been cordoned off, and the glass of water, along with the crumpled note bearing the word traitor, had been sent for analysis. The inspector had made it clear that no one was to leave the estate until he had completed his interviews, a directive that hung over the gathering like a storm cloud. Miss Marple, though not officially part of the investigation, had been granted permission to sit in on the interviews, a concession she suspected was due to Lady Beatrice's quiet influence. The old lady's reputation for unraveling mysteries had evidently preceded her, and she intended to make full use of the opportunity. As the guests dispersed after breakfast, she followed Inspector Harrow to the library, where he had set up a makeshift office. The room was a haven of leather-bound books and polished mahogany, its tall windows overlooking the mist-shrouded gardens. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Harrow settled behind a desk, his notebook open, and gestured for Miss Marple to take a seat near the fire. "I'll be speaking to each guest individually," he said, his tone brisk but not unkind. "Your insights, Miss Marple, may prove useful, provided you don't interfere." "I assure you, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft and deferential, "I am here only to observe, but I find that people often reveal more than they intend, especially when they think no one is listening." Harrow raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning his attention to the first interviewee, Victor Langston. The financier entered the library with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding rooms, though Miss Marple noted a slight tightness around his mouth, a sign of strain beneath his polished exterior. "Mr. Langston," Harrow began, "let's go over your movements last night. You said Thompson left your room at 8 o'clock to attend to correspondence. Can anyone confirm your whereabouts after that?" Langston leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "I joined the others for dinner, as you know. I was there until the scream was heard. I had no reason to visit the servants' quarters, and I certainly had no cause to harm Thompson. He was a loyal man, indispensable to me." "Loyal," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself, "and yet someone called him a traitor. Curious, don't you think?" Langston's eyes could want in a valet. Harrow scribbled a note. "And these anonymous letters Lady Beatrice mentioned, you've no idea who might have sent them?" "None," Langston said firmly. "If I were to guess, I'd say it's some disgruntled servant or a local with a grudge against the Ashford family. People of wealth always attract such nonsense." Miss Marple's needles, now retrieved from her bag, began their gentle clicking. She said nothing, but her mind lingered on Langston's choice of words. Disgruntled servant. A convenient deflection, perhaps, or a hint of something more personal. Next came Clara Ashford, her auburn hair slightly dishevelled, her eyes red from crying. She sat nervously, twisting her engagement ring as she spoke. "I barely knew Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice trembling. "He seemed quiet, always in Mr. Langston's shadow. I was with Aunt Beatrice most of the evening, planning the wedding. I didn't see anything unusual." "And your fiancé, Mr. Cavendish?" Harrow asked. "He was in the library around the time of the murder. Did you know he was there?" Clara hesitated, her fingers stilling. "No, I thought he was with me until dinner, but he did mention reading a book. It's not unusual for him to get distracted by work." Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the way Clara's eyes darted to the side. A small lie, perhaps, or simply the anxiety of a young woman caught in a nightmare. The old lady made a mental note to speak with Clara privately later. There was something in her manner that suggested more than mere grief. Lawrence Cavendish was next, his charm undiminished despite the circumstances. He repeated his story about the library, adding that he had been searching for a volume on contract law. "I was only there for 10 minutes, perhaps less," he said, his smile easy but his eyes wary. I heard nothing, saw nothing. The servants' hall was quiet when I passed by. And you didn't see Thompson? Harrow pressed. Not a soul, Lawrence replied, though Miss Marple caught the faintest twitch of his jaw, as if he was suppressing a thought. The interviews continued through the morning. Colonel Hargreaves blustered about his time in the smoking room, admitting he had dozed off briefly after his whiskey. Miss Evelyn Durant claimed to have been alone in the drawing-room, though she mentioned hearing footsteps in the corridor around 8:30, footsteps she assumed belonged to a servant. Dr. Percival Gray, pale and fidgety, insisted he had been in his room, though he could offer no corroboration beyond a book left open on his bedside table. As the last guest left the library, Miss Marple remained, her knitting a steady rhythm in the quiet room. Harrow turned to her, his expression a mix of curiosity and frustration. "Well, Miss Marple?"
Instance, Mr. Langston's loyalty to his valet seems genuine, yet he avoids discussing the note. And Mr. Cavendish's story about the library, it is convenient, is it not, that he was so near the scene of the crime? Harrow grunted, jotting down a note. "You think one of them is lying?" "Oh, I think several of them are lying," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "But not necessarily about murder. People lie about small things, lovers' quarrels, debts, old grudges. It's the pattern of lies that interests me." As she spoke, her eyes drifted to a small brass key on the desk, one Harrow had found in the servants' hall near the body. It was an unremarkable thing, likely for a cupboard or a drawer, but Miss Marple's mind turned it over like a puzzle piece. A key, a note, a glass of water, and a dead man. Each was a clue, and she was determined to find where they fit. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The mist that had cloaked Marwood Hall in the early morning had lifted by noon, revealing a sky of unrelenting grey that seemed to press down on the estate. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The guests, though permitted to move about the house, avoided one another's eyes, their conversations reduced to polite murmurs or strained silence. Miss Jane Marple, however, found the tension invigorating, like a fresh breeze stirring the cobwebs of her mind. She sat in the drawing-room, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the ticking of the grandfather clock, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet alertness of a cat watching a mouse. Inspector Harrow's interviews had yielded a tangle of alibis and half-truths, but no clear suspect. The forensic expert had confirmed that the glass of water in the servants' hall contained traces of cyanide, and the crumpled note with the word traitor was being examined for fingerprints. Yet the investigation seemed to stall, caught in the web of contradictory statements and elusive motives. Harrow, with his methodical approach, had turned his attention to Victor Langston, whose valet's death placed him at the center of suspicion. The inspector's focus on the financier was understandable, Miss Marple thought, but it risked blinding him to other possibilities. Langston himself was a study in composure, though Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened around his cigarette case when questioned about his business dealings. During a brief encounter in the corridor that morning, she had overheard him speaking sharply to a servant about a missing letter, his tone betraying a nervousness that belied his outward calm. "Find it, or there'll be trouble," he had snapped, unaware of Miss Marple's presence around the corner. A missing letter, she mused, could be significant, or it could chaos. "Damn disgrace, this business," he declared, pouring himself a generous measure of brandy from the decanter. "Poison of all things! In my day, a man faced his enemy with a sword or a pistol, not some coward's trick." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her expression mild. "Indeed, Colonel, poison does suggest a certain intimacy."
One must know the victim's habits to deliver it so precisely. Hargreaves paused, his glass halfway to his lips, as if her words had caught him off guard.
Intimacy, you say? Well, I suppose that's true. Thompson was Langston's man after all. Stands to reason Langston would know his routines better than anyone.
The suggestion hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the way Hargreaves' eyes gleamed with a hint of satisfaction, as if he relished the idea of casting suspicion on the financier. It was a classic red herring, she thought, a convenient scapegoat to divert attention. Hargreaves' military bluster and loud accusations made him an unlikely murderer. But his eagerness to point fingers intrigued her. Was he merely gossiping, or was he steering the narrative deliberately? As the colonel continued his tirade, Miss Evelyn Durant entered, her presence as commanding as ever despite the strain of the morning. Her silk dress rustled as she crossed the room, and she cast a theatrical glance at Hargreaves. "Really, Colonel, must you shout? We're all quite on edge without your bellowing." Hargreaves reddened, but fell silent, muttering into his brandy. Miss Durant settled onto a sofa, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of amusement. "You seem remarkably calm, Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth as velvet. "Most old ladies would be fainting at the thought of a murderer in the house." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking steadily. "I find that calmness allows one to see things more clearly, Miss Durant. For instance, I noticed you were in the drawing room last night, practicing lines, I believe you said." "Oh, yes," Miss Durant replied, her smile unwavering. "A habit from my stage days. I find it soothes the nerves. Though I confess, I heard nothing of poor Mr. Thompson's fate until the scream." "And the footsteps you mentioned to Inspector Harrow?" Miss Marple asked, her tone deceptively gentle. "You thought they belonged to a servant, but they were rather heavy, were they not?" Miss Durant's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Were they? I hadn't thought about it. One hears so many sounds in an old house like this." Miss Marple nodded, saying nothing more, but her mind catalogued the actress's quick recovery. Miss Durant was skilled at performance, and her vagueness about the footsteps felt rehearsed, as if she were concealing something, or someone. Another red herring, perhaps, or a thread worth pulling. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the gardens, her shawl drawn against the chill. The grounds were meticulously kept, but she noticed a patch of disturbed earth near the rose arbor, as if someone had trodden heavily there. Bending down, she spotted a glint of metal half buried in the soil, a cufflink engraved with the initials L.C. Lawrence Cavendish, she thought, her lips pursing. Had he dropped it during a hurried escape from the servants' quarters, or was it another distraction planted to mislead? She slipped the cufflink into her pocket, intending to return it to its owner with a few well-chosen questions. As she straightened, she saw Clara Ashford approaching, her face pale and her eyes darting nervously. "Miss Marple?" Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "May I speak with you? Alone?" "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but her senses alert. They sat on a stone bench beneath the arbor, and Clara's hands twisted in her lap, her engagement ring glinting in the dim light. "I'm so frightened," Clara confessed, her voice breaking. "Aunt Beatrice's letters. They mentioned a secret, something about Lawrence. I didn't want to believe it, but now with Mr. Thompson dead, I don't know what to think." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "What kind of secret, child?" Clara hesitated, then whispered, "Money. Lawrence has debts, more than he's told me. I overheard him arguing with Mr. Langston a few weeks ago, something about a loan. And now I wonder if he's involved somehow." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. Clara's revelation cast Lawrence in a new light, but it also raised questions about her own motives. Was she genuinely afraid, or was she deflecting suspicion from herself? The girl's distress seemed real, but Miss Marple knew that tears could hide as much as they revealed. As they returned to the house, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled. The cufflink, Clara's confession, Hargreaves's accusations, and Durant's evasions. All were pieces of a puzzle, some designed to mislead, others to illuminate. Inspector Harrow might focus on Langston, but Miss Marple suspected the truth lay deeper, in the shadows of human nature where secrets festered and motives intertwined. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The afternoon at Marwood Hall was marked by a restless quiet, the kind that follows a storm when the air is heavy with the promise of more to come. The guests had scattered to their rooms or the drawing room, their movements subdued, as if the weight of suspicion had settled into their bones. Miss Jane Marple, however, was undeterred by the oppressive atmosphere. She sat in a high-backed chair in the library, her knitting needles clicking softly. Her eye, discovered near the valet's body, was small and intricately wrought, likely for a drawer or a private cabinet. Miss Marple had noted its presence during the initial inspection of the servants' hall, and its significance had lingered in her mind. Why was it there, so close to the body? Had Thompson dropped it in his final moments, or had it been placed there deliberately? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, and she looked up to see Lady Beatrice entering the library, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said, her voice low, "I hope to find you alone. I am deeply troubled by this affair, and I believe you may see things that the inspector overlooks." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression attentive. "You are kind to say so, Lady Beatrice. I am merely an observer, but I do find that small details often reveal larger truths. For instance, this key, do you recognize it?" Lady Beatrice approached the desk, her eyes narrowing as she examined the key. "It looks like one of the keys to the family's private papers, kept in the study upstairs. But I cannot be certain. My late husband was meticulous about such things, and after his death I left most of his papers untouched." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the implications. "And the study, has anyone been in there recently?" "Not to my knowledge," Lady Beatrice replied, though her hesitation suggested a flicker of doubt. "The staff have access for cleaning, but the desk is always locked. Only I have the master key." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers brushing the key lightly. "Might I see the study, Lady Beatrice? It may shed light on this unfortunate event." Lady Beatrice agreed, and they ascended the grand staircase to the study, a small, oak-panelled room overlooking the estate's rose gardens. The desk, a heavy mahogany piece, was indeed locked, but Miss Marple noted a faint scratch near the keyhole, as if someone had fumbled with an unfamiliar key. Lady Beatrice produced her master key, and the drawer opened smoothly, revealing a collection of letters, ledgers, and a small, leather-bound notebook. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the notebook, its pages slightly worn, as if it had been handled frequently. "May I?" she asked, and at Lady Beatrice's nod, she opened the notebook. The pages were filled with cryptic notations, dates, initials, and sums of money written in a precise hand. One entry caught her attention. "L.C. £5,000, overdue." Lawrence Cavendish, she thought, her mind connecting the initials to Clara's earlier revelation about his debts. "This may be significant," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but her eyes gleaming. "It seems Mr. Thompson, or perhaps his employer, was keeping careful records. Might I borrow this for further study?" "Marple, be discreet." As they returned downstairs, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion in the hall. Inspector Harrow stood at the center of a small crowd, holding a folded letter that bore the same elegant handwriting as the anonymous threats Lady Beatrice had described. "Found this in Mr. Langston's room," Harrow announced, his voice grim. "Hidden in a cigarette case of all places." Victor Langston, standing nearby, paled, but recovered quickly. "That's preposterous, Inspector. I've never seen that letter before. Someone must have planted it." The accusation drew gasps from the gathered guests. Colonel Hargreaves muttered about shady financiers, while Miss Durant's eyes widened with theatrical surprise. Lawrence Cavendish, standing beside Clara, gripped her arm tightly, his face unreadable. Miss Marple, however, noted a small detail. The letter's edge was slightly crumpled, as if it had been hastily folded. It was a minor inconsistency, but it nagged at her, like a stitch dropped in her knitting. Later, as the guests dispersed, Miss Marple approached Lawrence Cavendish in the corridor, the cufflink she had found in the garden held delicately in her hand. "Mr. Cavendish," she said, her voice gentle but probing, "I believe this belongs to you. I found it near the rose arbor. An odd place for such a fine item, don't you think?" Lawrence's smile faltered, his hand reaching for the cufflink almost reflexively. "Why, thank you, Miss Marple. I must have dropped it during a walk. Clumsy of me." "Indeed," she replied, her eyes meeting his, though the ground was quite disturbed there, as if someone had been in a hurry. "You weren't in the gardens last night, were you?" "No, of course not," he said quickly, but his fingers fumbled as he pocketed the cufflink. "I was in the library, as I told the inspector." Miss Marple nodded, saying nothing more, but her mind was alight with possibilities. The notebook, the letter, the cufflink, the key. Each was a clue, and each pointed to a web of connections she was only beginning to untangle. The letter in Langston's room was too convenient, she thought, a classic distraction meant to mislead. But the notebook, with its record of Lawrence's debts, and the cufflink, so carelessly dropped, suggested a deeper truth. Someone in Marwood Hall was playing a dangerous game, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the next piece of the puzzle. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The atmosphere in Marwood Hall grew thicker with each passing hour, as if the very walls absorbed the secrets and suspicions of its inhabitants. By late afternoon, the grey sky had given way to a drizzle that pattered against the windows, casting a mournful pall over the estate. Miss Jane Marple, undaunted by the gloom, sat in the drawing-room, her knitting a steady rhythm in her hands. Her eyes, however, were far from idle, darting from one guest to another as they
drifted in and out, their faces betraying the strain of the ongoing investigation. The discovery of the anonymous letter in Victor Langston's room had set tongues wagging, and Miss Marple sensed that the facade of civility was beginning to crack. Inspector Harrow, dogged in his pursuit of the truth, had spent the day questioning the staff, hoping to uncover a witness to Thompson's final moments. His efforts had yielded little, save for the confirmation that the servants' hall was rarely visited by the guests, making Lawrence Cavendish's presence in the nearby library all the more conspicuous. Miss Marple, however, was more intrigued by the small brass key and the leather-bound notebook she had borrowed from Lady Beatrice's study. The notebook's cryptic entries, particularly the one noting Lawrence's overdue debt, suggested a financial tangle that might hold the key to the murder. As the clock struck 4, Miss Marple decided to seek out Clara Ashford, whose earlier confession about Lawrence's debts had lingered in her mind. She found the young woman in the conservatory, surrounded by potted ferns and the faint scent of damp earth. Clara was staring out at the rain-soaked gardens, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. "Miss Ashford," Miss Marple said softly, settling onto a wicker chair beside her. "I hoped we might continue our conversation from earlier. You mentioned something about Mr. Cavendish's financial troubles. Might you tell me more?" Clara's hands twisted in her lap, her engagement ring catching the dim light. "I shouldn't have said anything," she whispered. her voice barely audible over the patter of rain. "It's just, I overheard Lawrence and Mr. Langston arguing at a dinner party in London a month ago. Lawrence was desperate, asking for more time to repay a loan. Mr. Langston was furious, said something about consequences if Lawrence didn't settle his debts." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. "And did Mr. Thompson ever mention anything about his employer's business dealings? As a valet, he would have been privy to many private conversations." Clara shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Not to me. But I saw him once, in the corridor at Aunt Beatrice's London house, passing a letter to Lawrence. It looked secretive. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" Miss Marple nodded, patting Clara's hand gently. The image of Thompson passing a letter to Lawrence was a new thread in the tapestry, one that suggested the valet was more than a mere servant. Was he a go-between, a spy, or something else entirely? And what of the word traitor scrawled on the note beside his body? The pieces were beginning to align, but the pattern was still obscured. As Clara excused herself, Scholar's reclusive nature had made him a peripheral figure in the investigation, but Miss Marple had not overlooked him. His trembling hands during dinner and his vague alibi piqued her curiosity. "Dr. Gray," she said, her voice gentle as she took a seat nearby, "you seem quite absorbed in your reading. I understand you specialize in rare manuscripts. Have you ever come across anything in your studies about ciphers or coded messages?" Gray started, his book slipping slightly in his hands. "Ciphers? Why, no, not particularly. My work is more historical. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely a passing thought," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking softly. "The notebook in Lady Beatrice's study contains some curious notations, initials, sums, dates. They reminded me of the sort of codes one might find in a spy novel. I wondered if you, with your expertise, might have an opinion." Gray's face paled, and he adjusted his spectacles with a trembling hand. "I haven't seen the notebook," he said quickly, "but I assure you, I have no interest in such things. I was in my room last night, as I told the inspector, reading until dinner." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes never leaving his. "Of course. Though it's curious, isn't it, how a scholar of your caliber might overlook a detail like the time. You said you were reading until 8, but the maid mentioned seeing you in the corridor near the servants' quarters around 7:45. Gray's mouth opened, then closed, his composure faltering. "You must be mistaken," he stammered. I may have stepped out briefly to fetch a glass of water." "From the servants' hall?" Miss Marple asked, her tone deceptively mild. No, from my room," Gray snapped, his voice rising before he caught himself. "I mean, I don't recall exactly. It was a trivial errand." Miss Marple nodded, saying nothing more, but her mind catalogued the lie. Gray's nervousness, his insistence on a solitary alibi, and his proximity to the servants' hall at a critical time suggested he was hiding something. Was it fear, guilt, or merely embarrassment over a private matter? As evening approached, Miss Marple joined the guests for tea in the drawing-room, where the conversation turned inevitably to the murder. Colonel Hargreaves, emboldened by another glass of brandy, pointed an accusing finger at Victor Langston. "Mark my words, it's that financier's doing. Shady business, shady man. That letter in his room proves it." Langston's eyes flashed with anger. "I've told you, Colonel, that letter was planted. I've no reason to kill my own valet. If anything, Thompson's death is a blow to me." Miss Evelyn Durant, ever the actress, leaned forward with a dramatic sigh. "Oh, but Mr. Langston, surely you must know something.
A map
noted the way Langston's jaw tightened, his hand clenching into a fist. Before he could respond, Laurent Cavendish intervened, his voice smooth but strained. "Let's not leap to conclusions, Miss Durant. We're all under suspicion here, and throwing accusations won't help." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Laurent's, noting the way he avoided Langston's gaze. The web of lies was growing, she thought. Clara's revelation about the debt, Gray's shaky alibi, Langston's defensive posture, and Durant's calculated provocation. Each guest was hiding something, and the truth lay buried beneath their carefully constructed facades. The brass key, the notebook, and the crumpled note were the keys to unlocking it, but Miss Marple knew she needed one more piece to bring the pattern into focus. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The drizzle that had cloaked Marwood Hall throughout the day had thickened into a steady rain by evening, drumming against the windows and casting a mournful rhythm over the estate. The drawing room, where the guests had gathered for an uneasy dinner, was a study in strained civility. The clink of cutlery and the murmur of forced conversation did little to mask the undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the fireplace with her knitting in her lap, observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity, her eyes flitting from one guest to another, noting the cracks in their carefully maintained facades. The discovery of the anonymous letter in Victor Langston's room, the cryptic notebook from the study, and the small brass key found near Thompson's body had deepened the mystery, but Miss Marple sensed that the truth was beginning to surface, like a submerged stone revealed by a receding tide. The lies and half-truths she had uncovered, Clara's revelation about Laurence's debts, Dr. Gray's shaky alibi, and the convenient accusations against Langston, were threads in a tapestry that was growing ever more intricate. Yet it was the emotional undercurrents, the moments of unguarded vulnerability, that she knew would ultimately unravel the puzzle. As the meal drew to a close, Miss Evelyn Durant, ever the performer, rose from her seat with a dramatic flourish, her silk scarf trailing behind her. "I cannot bear this any longer," she declared, her voice trembling with theatrical emotion. "A man is dead, and we sit here pretending all is well, while a murderer walks among us. I, for one, demand answers." Her outburst drew startled glances from the other guests. Colonel Hargreaves snorted, muttering about hysterical women, while Victor Langston's lips curled in a faint dismissive smile. Laurent Cavendish into panic.
The inspector is doing all he can, and we must trust in his methods. But Miss Durant was not to be soothed. Her eyes, bright with unshed tears, fixed on Victor Langston. "You know more than you're letting on, Mr. Langston," she said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Thompson was your man, and that letter in your room, it wasn't there by accident. What was he to you? A servant or something more?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. Langston's face darkened, his composure slipping for the first time. "You go too far, madam," he snapped, rising to his feet. "I've told the inspector everything I know. Thompson was my valet, nothing more. If you're looking for a villain, perhaps you should examine your own secrets. An actress with a fading career might have reasons to stir trouble." The room gasped, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing. The exchange was more than a spat. It was a crack in the dam, a moment of raw emotion that revealed the fault lines beneath the surface. Miss Durant's face flushed, her lips trembling, as if she were on the verge of a retort, but instead she turned and fled the room, her scarf fluttering behind her like a banner of distress. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind racing. The actress's outburst had been calculated, she was certain, but it had also been genuine, a rare glimpse of truth in a house full of performances. She made a mental note to speak with Miss Durant privately, suspecting that the actress's flair for drama might conceal a deeper knowledge of the events at Marwood Hall. As the guests began to disperse, Miss Marple caught sight of Clara Ashford slipping out of the room, her movements furtive. Sensing an opportunity, the old lady followed, her steps silent on the thick carpet. She found Clara in the conservatory, standing by the same window where they had spoken earlier, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, approaching with the care of one soothing a frightened animal, "you are troubled. Will you not tell me what weighs so heavily on you?" Clara turned, her eyes red and brimming with tears. "Oh, Miss Marple, I can't bear it. I've been such a fool, Lawrence. He's not what I thought. I found something in his room this morning when I went to fetch his jacket. A letter in his handwriting addressed to Mr. Langston. It said he'd do anything to clear his debts, even if it meant removing obstacles." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained calm. "And you believe this letter refers to Mr. Thompson?" Clara nodded, her voice breaking. "I don't want to believe it, but what else could it mean? Lawrence was so angry after his argument with Mr. Langston, and now Thompson is dead, and that note, traitor, it's all too damning piece of evidence. But it was also suspiciously convenient, much like the anonymous letter found in Langston's room. Was it genuine, or another carefully placed red herring? And why had Clara chosen this moment to reveal it? The girl's distress seemed real, but Miss Marple knew that emotion could be a mask as much as a revelation. "Keep this to yourself for now, my dear," Miss Marple advised, her voice firm but kind. "And do not confront Mr. Cavendish. We must be certain of the facts before we act." Clara nodded, wiping her tears, and Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, her thoughts a whirl of possibilities. The letter, the key, the notebook, and now Clara's revelation. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. As she resumed her knitting, she overheard a heated exchange in the corridor. Colonel Hargreaves and Dr. Gray, their voices low but intense. "You're a fool if you think Langston's innocent," Hargreaves growled. "That man's up to his neck in shady deals, and Thompson knew too much. Why else would he be killed?" Dr. Gray's response was sharp, almost panicked. "You don't know what you're talking about, Colonel. Leave it to the police. You'll only make things worse." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, but her mind was alight. Gray's defensiveness, Clara's confession, and Durant's outburst were all threads pulling tighter, drawing the truth closer to the surface. The emotional turning point had arrived, and with it, the first clear glimpse of the motives that drove the killer. Someone in Marwood Hall was desperate, and desperation, Miss Marple knew, was a dangerous spark in a house already primed to burn. Chapter 9. The Trap. The rain had ceased by the morning of the third day at Marwood Hall, leaving the air crisp and the grounds glistening with dew. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained heavy, charged with the unspoken fears and accusations that had grown since Thompson's murder. Miss Jane Marple, ever observant, sensed that the time had come to apply a gentle pressure to the fragile web of secrets she had been weaving in her mind. Her knitting lay untouched in her room, a rare departure from her usual habit, as she focused her energies on setting a trap to draw out the truth. The clues, the brass key, The notebook, the cufflink, and Clara's revelation about Lawrence's letter had formed a pattern, but it was the human element, the frailties and fears of the guests, that would bring the mystery to light. Miss Marple had requested a private word with Lady Beatrice after breakfast, and the two women now sat in the study, the door firmly closed against prying ears. The room, with its heavy mahogany desk and shelves of leather-bound books, felt like a sanctuary.
Believe we are nearing the truth of Mr. Thompson's death, but to uncover it, we must act with care. The murderer is among us, and they are growing anxious. I propose a gathering this evening where we might encourage certain revelations. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened, but her composure held. You mean to confront the guests? That could be dangerous, Miss Marple. Not a confrontation, my dear, Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling with quiet determination. Merely a conversation designed to unsettle. People reveal their true selves when they feel the net closing, and I believe a few well-placed questions will do just that. Lady Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. Very well. I trust your judgment. What do you require? A gathering in the drawing-room after dinner, Miss Marple said. All the guests, and Inspector Harrow, if he can be persuaded. I shall need your assistance to ensure everyone attends, and perhaps a small piece of information you've not yet shared about the anonymous letters. Is there anything more you can tell me? Lady Beatrice's fingers tightened on the arm of her chair. There is one thing, she admitted, her voice low. The last letter, received just before the weekend, mentioned a debt of honor that would be repaid in blood. I didn't tell the inspector as I feared it would cast suspicion on Clara or Lawrence. But it frightened me, Miss Marple. It was so personal. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind fitting this new piece into the puzzle. A debt of honor, coupled with Lawrence's financial troubles and the notebook's cryptic entries, suggested a motive rooted in pride as much as money. Thank you, Lady Beatrice, she said. That is most helpful. Now let us prepare for this evening. The drawing-room was aglow with candlelight as the guests assembled after dinner, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Inspector Harrow stood near the fireplace, his notebook at the ready, his expression one of cautious skepticism. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting now resumed, appeared unassuming, but her eyes were sharp, watching every movement, every glance. Lady Beatrice, as hostess, opened the gathering with a measured tone. My friends, I know this has been a trying time. Miss Marple has requested we come together to discuss the events surrounding Mr. Thompson's death in the hope that we may assist the inspector in his inquiries. I ask for your patience and candor. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice gentle, but carrying a quiet authority. Thank you, Lady Beatrice. I am no detective, merely an old lady with a fondness for puzzles. But I have observed certain inconsistencies in what we have been told. For instance, the brass key found near Mr. Thompson's body. It unlocks a drawer in this very house, does it not, Lady Beatrice?
Late husband kept his private papers. A murmur rippled through the room. Victor Langston's eyes narrowed, while Lawrence Cavendish shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Miss Marple continued, her tone deceptively mild. And in that drawer we found a notebook, with entries suggesting financial dealings. One entry in particular caught my attention. A debt owed by L.C., Mr. Lawrence Cavendish, I presume? Lawrence's face flushed, but he managed a weak smile. I've already explained my financial situation to Clara. It's no secret, but I had nothing to do with Thompson's death. Perhaps not, Miss Marple said, her eyes meeting his. But there is also the matter of a cufflink found in the garden near the rose arbor bearing your initials. An odd place for such a personal item, especially as you claim to have been in the library at the time of the murder.
The room tensed, and Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting to Lawrence. Colonel Hargreaves snorted, muttering, "Damn suspicious, if you ask me." Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm but firm. "There is more. A letter found by Miss Ashford in Mr. Cavendish's handwriting suggesting a willingness to remove obstacles to clear his debts. And yet, Mr. Langston, another letter was found in your room accusing you of betrayal. It seems there are many secrets in Marwood Hall, and someone is eager to point fingers." Victor Langston rose, his voice sharp. "I've said it before, that letter was planted. I had no quarrel with Thompson. He was loyal to a fault." "Loyal," Miss Marple mused, her eyes flickering to Dr. Gray, who sat rigid in his chair. "And yet, Dr. Gray, you were seen near the servants' hall shortly before the murder, despite claiming to be in your room. And, Miss Durant, you heard footsteps, heavy ones, not those of a servant. Perhaps you saw more than you've admitted." Miss Durant's smile was tight, her voice cool. "I've told you all I know, Miss Marple. I'm an actress, not a detective." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze sweeping the room. "Of course, but someone here knows the truth. The word traitor was written for a reason. The key, the notebook, the letters all point to a motive rooted in betrayal, perhaps a debt of honor, as one of the anonymous letters suggested. I wonder, who among us feels betrayed?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. Then Dr. Gray, his face pale and his hands trembling, rose abruptly. "This is intolerable," he cried. "I won't sit here and be accused by an old woman playing at detective. I had nothing to do with Thompson's death." His outburst was met with stunned silence, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. She had cast her net, and the fish were beginning to thrash.
Hall was a crucible of tension, the candlelight flickering across the faces of the guests as they absorbed the weight of Miss Jane Marple's carefully chosen words. Dr. Percival Gray's outburst had left a palpable unease in its wake, his abrupt departure from the room drawing every eye. Miss Marple, seated calmly with her knitting now resting in her lap, noted the reactions of those remaining. Victor Langston's clenched jaw, Lawrence Cavendish's pale face, Clara Ashford's trembling hands, and Miss Evelyn Durant's carefully neutral expression. Inspector Harrow, standing by the fireplace, scribbled furiously in his notebook, his eyes darting between the guests as if sensing the moment of truth was near. Miss Marple rose slowly, her frail figure belying the sharpness of her mind. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice soft but commanding attention, "I believe we are ready to unravel the mystery of Mr. Thompson's death. It is a tale of betrayal, greed, and a carefully laid plan that has, I fear, unraveled under scrutiny." The room fell silent, every gaze fixed on her. Lady Beatrice, seated near the door, nodded encouragingly. Though her face was pale with anticipation, Miss Marple continued, her tone measured, as if recounting a story she had pieced together, stitch by stitch. "Let us begin with the facts," she said. "Mr. Thompson, a valet, was poisoned with cyanide in the servants' hall, a place where guests rarely ventured. Near his body was a note bearing the word traitor, a brass key, and a glass of water laced with poison. These clues at first glance seem disparate, but they tell a story when viewed together." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "The key, as Lady Beatrice confirmed, unlocks a drawer in the study, where we found a notebook detailing financial transactions. One entry noted a debt owed by L.C., Mr. Lawrence Cavendish, for £5,000 overdue. This, combined with Miss Ashford's discovery of a letter in Mr. Cavendish's handwriting suggesting he would remove obstacles to clear his debts, points to a motive. Mr. Cavendish, it seems, was in financial distress, and Mr. Thompson, as Mr. Langston's valet, may have known too much about those debts. Lawrence Cavendish leapt to his feet, his face flushed. "This is outrageous. I admit I owe Langston money, but I had nothing to do with Thompson's death. That letter Clara found, it was about a business deal, not murder." Miss Marple raised a hand, her expression serene but unyielding. "Please, Mr. Cavendish, let me continue. Your cufflink, found near the rose arbor, placed you near the scene of the crime, despite your claim of being in the library. But I believe the cufflink was not dropped by accident. It's beginning to fray." "Mr. Langston, you have insisted that the anonymous letter found in your room was planted, and I am inclined to agree. It was too convenient, much like the cufflink. But your valet, Mr. Thompson, was not merely a servant, was he? The notebook suggests he was involved in your financial dealings, perhaps as a courier or a confidant. Did he know something that made him a liability?" Langston's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent, his fingers tightening around his cigarette case. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "The word traitor is the key to this puzzle. It suggests a betrayal, not of you, Mr. Langston, but of someone else. Someone who felt betrayed by Thompson's actions, perhaps because he was passing information to another party." Her eyes flickered to Dr. Percival Gray, who had re-entered the room quietly, and now stood near the door, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Dr. Gray," she said, her tone gentle but piercing, "you have been most reticent, but your nervousness betrays you. You were seen near the servants' hall at 7:45, despite claiming to be in your room. And your expertise in manuscripts, might it extend to deciphering codes, such as those in the notebook?" Gray's face crumpled, and he sank into a chair, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean for this to happen. Thompson was my cousin, you see. He came to me months ago, saying he had uncovered something in Langston's dealings, fraud, embezzlement, things that could ruin him. He was passing me documents, hoping I could expose Langston, but I grew frightened. I told him to stop, that it was too dangerous. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes softening, but her mind razor-sharp. "And when he refused, you felt betrayed. You knew his habits, his preference for a glass of water after dinner. You had access to cyanide, likely obtained from a chemical supplier, or perhaps a dark corner of the estate's greenhouse. The note with the word traitor was a deliberate accusation, meant to point fingers at Langston. But it was you, Dr. Gray, who wrote it, wasn't it?" Dr. Gray's shoulders slumped, his voice breaking. "He was going to ruin everything. I begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. He said he could make a fortune by blackmailing Langston. I couldn't let him destroy my reputation, my work. I only meant to scare him, but the dose was too strong." A collective gasp filled the room. Victor Langston's face turned ashen, his cigarette case falling to the floor. Clara clung to Lawrence, her eyes wide with shock. Miss Evelyn Durand's hand flew to her mouth, her theatrical composure shattered. Colonel serene. "It is always a sad business," she murmured, "when pride and fear drive a man to such extremes. But the truth, like a good piece of knitting, always comes together in the end." Chapter 11. The Reflection. The drawing room of Marwood Hall, so recently a stage for revelations and accusations, now lay quiet, the candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. Dr. Percival Gray's confession and subsequent arrest had left the guests in a state of stunned silence, their faces a mixture of relief and unease. The truth, though uncovered, had brought no joy, only the somber realization of how fear and desperation could twist a man's soul. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting once more in her hands, observed the scene with a quiet compassion, her needles moving in their familiar rhythm as if to restore order to the chaos of the past days. Inspector Harrow, his notebook now closed, stood near the door, conferring quietly with his constable. The air of authority he carried was tempered by a weariness, as if the resolution of the case had drained him as much as it had the guests. Lady Beatrice, ever the gracious hostess, rose to offer a few words of reassurance, though her voice trembled slightly. "My friends," she said, "this has been a dreadful ordeal, but thanks to Miss Marple's keen insight, we may now find some peace. I ask that you rest tonight, and we shall face the morning together." The guests murmured their assent, though their eyes betrayed lingering doubts. Victor Langston, his composure partially restored, lit a cigarette with shaking hands, his gaze fixed on the fire. Lawrence Cavendish and Clara Ashford sat close together, their hands clasped, their faces a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that Lawrence was cleared, guilt for the suspicions that had briefly torn them apart. Miss Evelyn Durant, her theatrical flair subdued, sipped a glass of sherry, her eyes distant. Colonel Hargreaves, for once subdued, muttered something about needing a stiff drink and excused himself. Miss Marple, however, remained, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the crackling fire. Inspector Harrow approached her, his expression one of grudging admiration. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I'll admit I was skeptical of your methods, but you've a sharper mind than most detectives I've met. How did you know it was grey?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing. "Oh, Inspector, it is not so much a matter of knowing as of seeing. People are like patterns in a piece of knitting. Each stitch, each loop tells a story. Dr. Gray's nervousness, his vague alibi, his proximity to the servants' hall, all were small stitches, but they formed a pattern of fear. The word traitor was the key, you see. It was not aimed at Mr. Langston, as we were meant to believe, but at Thompson himself for betraying his cousin's trust." Harrow nodded.
"In Cavendish's room, those were distractions."
"Precisely," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "Dr. Gray was clever, but not clever enough. He planted the cufflink to implicate Mr. Cavendish, knowing of his debts, and the letter in Mr. Langston's room to muddy the waters. But he could not hide his own fear, his own trembling hands. In the end, it is always the human heart that betrays the guilty." Harrow shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "You make it sound simple, Miss Marple. I'll have to keep an eye on you in case we cross paths again." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "I am merely an old lady, Inspector, with a fondness for puzzles and a habit of noticing what others overlook. But I shall be happy to return to my quiet life in St. Mary Mead, where the mysteries are, I hope, less deadly." As Harrow departed to oversee Dr. Gray's transfer to the county jail, Lady Beatrice approached, her face etched with gratitude. "Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough. You've saved this house from further ruin. Will you stay another day, to rest?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "You are most kind, Lady Beatrice, but I think it best I return home tomorrow. There are roses in my garden that need tending, and I find a little quiet does wonders for the soul." That night, as she packed her modest suitcase, Miss Marple reflected on the events of the weekend. The murder of Thompson, the web of lies, the secrets of Marwood Hall, all had been a reminder of the fragility of human nature. She thought of Dr. Gray, a man driven to murder by fear of disgrace, and of the others, each hiding their own small truths. It was a sad business, as she had said, but it was also a reminder that even in the darkest of mysteries, The truth could be found by those who looked closely enough. As she settled into bed, the rain began again, a soft patter against the windows. Miss Marple closed her eyes, her mind already turning to the simple pleasures of St. Mary Mead, the roses, the tea, the gentle gossip of village life. But she knew, too, that wherever she went, the puzzles of human nature would follow, and she would be ready, with her sharp eyes and her quiet wisdom, to unravel them. Chapter 12. The Departure. The morning sun broke through the clouds over Marwood Hall, casting a tentative golden light across the dew-drenched gardens. The estate, so recently a stage for tragedy and suspicion, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if the resolution of Thompson's murder had lifted a shadow from its ancient walls. Miss Jane Marple, a modest suitcase packed and her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, stood in the grand foyer, she said, clasping the old lady's hands. "I cannot express how grateful I am for your presence this weekend. You have brought clarity to a dark moment, and we are all in your debt." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained humble. "You are too kind, Lady Beatrice. I did only what anyone might do, with a little attention to detail and a touch of curiosity. I am glad to have been of service." As they spoke, Clara Ashford and Lawrence Cavendish approached, their hands still clasped, their faces brighter than they had been in days. Clara's eyes were clear of tears, and Lawrence's smile, though tempered by recent events, held a genuine warmth. "Miss Marple," Clara said softly, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved Lawrence from suspicion, and you've given us a chance to start anew." Lawrence nodded, his voice earnest. "I'll admit I was terrified when those clues pointed to me. The cufflink, the letter. But you saw through the deception. I'm in your debt, and I promise to be more honest with Clara about my troubles." Miss Marple smiled gently, her gaze softening. "Honesty is a fine foundation for a marriage, Mr. Cavendish. And Miss Ashford, you must trust your heart, but also your head. You have a sharp mind. Use it." The couple nodded, their gratitude evident, and stepped aside as Victor Langston approached. The financier, though still shaken by the revelations about his valet and the accusations against him, offered a curt nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff, "I misjudged you. I thought you an interfering old woman, but you've a knack for seeing what others miss. My business dealings may not be spotless, but I assure you I had no part in Thompson's death." "I never thought you did, Mr. Langston," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but her eyes keen. "But you might consider choosing your confidants more carefully in the future. Loyalty is a precious thing, easily broken." Langston's lips twitched, as if suppressing a retort, but he merely nodded and stepped away. Miss Evelyn Durant was next, her theatrical flair subdued but not entirely absent. She offered Miss Marple a dramatic curtsy, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple," she said. "I half expected you to accuse me with all my talk of footsteps and secrets. You've given me material for a play, I think. A mystery with an old lady as the hero." Miss Marple chuckled, her needles clicking softly in her bag. "I'm afraid I'd make a rather dull hero, Miss Durant. But I'm glad to know you'll find some inspiration in this sad affair." Colonel Hargreaves, lingering near the door with a glass of brandy, raised it, her smile serene. "A wise policy, Colonel. The quiet ones often have the most to say, if you listen closely." As the carriage arrived to take her to the station, Miss Marple took one last look at Marwood Hall. its stone facade softened by the morning light. The events of the weekend, the murder, the lies, the unraveling of Dr. Gray's desperate act, had left their mark, but the house would endure, as it had for centuries. She climbed into the carriage, her suitcase at her feet, and as the horses pulled away, she reflected on the lessons of the case. Human nature, she thought, was as predictable as it was complex. The motives of greed, fear, and betrayal were not unique to Marwood Hall. They were the same in her little village of St. Mary Mead, where gossip and grudges could be just as deadly in their own way. Dr. Gray's fall was a reminder that even the most scholarly mind could be undone by pride, and that the smallest details, a key, a note, a trembling hand, could reveal the deepest truths. As the countryside rolled by, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to home. The roses in her garden would need pruning, and her friend Mrs. Bantry would no doubt be eager for a full account of the weekend's drama over tea. She smiled to herself, her fingers itching for her knitting needles. There would always be another puzzle, another pattern to unravel, and she would be ready, with her quiet wisdom and her unerring eye for the truth. Chapter 13. A Quiet Return. The train to St. Mary Mead rattled gently through the countryside, its rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the tumult of the past days at Marwood Hall. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her modest suitcase tucked beneath her seat, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, comforting cadence. The rolling hills, dappled with the golden light of late summer, stretched out before her, and she allowed herself a moment to savor the simplicity of the view. The events of the weekend, the murder, the web of lies, and Dr. Gray's desperate confession seemed almost like a dream now, fading into the quiet routine of her village life. Yet Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. As her needles clicked, she reflected on the intricacies of the case. The way each clue, the brass key, the notebook, the cufflink, the note marked traitor, had fit together to reveal the truth. Dr. Gray's motive, rooted in fear of disgrace and betrayal by his cousin, was a stark reminder of how even the most scholarly mind could be undone by human weakness. She thought, too, of the other guests, Clara and Lawrence, whose love had been tested but endured, Victor Langston, whose secrets had nearly cost him his reputation, Miss Durant, thoughts turning to the comforts of home, her cottage, her roses, and the inevitable tea with Mrs. Bantry, who would be eager to hear every detail of the Marwood Hall affair. She smiled to herself, knowing that her friend's penchant for gossip would make the retelling almost as lively as the events themselves. As she stepped onto the platform, the station master tipped his hat, his face breaking into a grin. "Welcome back, Miss Marple. Been solving mysteries again, have you?" Miss Marple chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, nothing so grand, Mr. Jenkins, just a little holiday with some unexpected excitement." She made her way down the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead, the air sweet with the scent of blooming honeysuckle. Her cottage came into view, its thatched roof and neatly tended garden a welcome sight. As she unlocked the door, she was greeted by the soft ticking of her grandfather clock and the faint aroma of lavender from the sachets she kept in the drawers. It was a world away from the grandeur and intrigue of Marwood Hall, and yet Miss Marple knew the human heart was the same everywhere, full of secrets, hopes, and frailties. After settling in, she took a moment to inspect her roses, noting with satisfaction that they had thrived in her absence, thanks to the diligent care of her neighbor's boy. She clipped a few wilted blooms, her hands steady and sure, and carried a small bouquet inside to brighten her sitting room. As she arranged the flowers in a vase, her thoughts drifted back to the case, to the small details that had led her to the truth. The brass key, so easily overlooked, had unlocked a drawer of secrets. The word traitor, scrawled in haste, had betrayed the killer's heart. It was always the small things, she mused, that told the greatest stories. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Bantry arrived, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Jane, you must tell me everything," she exclaimed, settling into an armchair with a cup of tea. "A murder at Marwood Hall? I heard whispers in the village, but I want the full story." Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "It was a sad affair, Dolly, as these things often are. A man driven to murder by fear, and a house full of secrets that nearly tore it apart. But in the end, the truth came out, as it always does." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice eager. "And you solved it, didn't you? Oh, Jane, you're wasted in St. Mary Mead. You should be in London working with Scotland Yard." Miss Marple laughed softly, shaking her head. "Nonsense, my dear. I'm quite content here, with my roses and my knitting. Besides, there are mysteries enough in St. Mary Mead, if one knows where to look." As the two women chatted, the afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. Miss Marple's mind, though at ease, remained ever alert, ready for the next puzzle. The
grand halls of estates like Marwood. The human heart was always weaving its own intricate patterns, waiting for someone with sharp eyes and a patient hand to unravel them. Chapter 14. The Echoes of Truth. The late summer days in St. Mary Mead unfolded with their usual gentle rhythm, the village settling back into its quiet routines, as if untouched by the drama of Marwood Hall. Miss Jane Marple, now comfortably ensconced in her cottage, found solace in the familiar tasks of tending her roses and brewing her morning tea. Yet the echoes of the recent mystery lingered in her mind, like the faint notes of a melody that refused to fade. Her knitting needles, ever present, clicked softly as she sat by the window, her thoughts weaving through the events that had unfolded at Lady Beatrice's estate. The resolution of Thompson's murder had brought a measure of peace to Marwood Hall, but Miss Marple knew that such events left ripples, subtle but enduring. She had received a letter from Lady Beatrice that morning, written in her elegant hand, expressing gratitude once more, and sharing news of the guests' departures. Clara and Lawrence were planning their wedding, their bond strengthened by the ordeal. Victor Langston had returned to London, his business dealings under scrutiny, but his reputation intact, at least for now. Miss Evelyn Durant was already pitching her play idea to a London theatre, with a promise to dedicate the production to the sharpest mind in St. Mary Mead. Colonel Hargreaves, true to form, had written a blustering letter to the local paper about the decline of honour in modern society, though he made no mention of Miss Marple's role. As she read the letter, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Dr. Percival Gray, now awaiting trial in the county jail. His confession had been a moment of raw truth, a stark reminder of how fear could corrupt even the most scholarly mind. She felt no triumph in his downfall, only a quiet sadness for a man who had let pride and panic lead him to such a tragic end. The word traitor, scrawled in his hand, had been his undoing, a cry of betrayal that revealed his own guilt more than Thompson's. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Bantry swept in, her cheeks flushed with excitement, a basket of freshly baked scones in her hands. "Jane, I've just heard the most extraordinary thing," she exclaimed, setting the basket on the table. "The vicar's wife says there's talk in the village about a mysterious letter found in the church donation box, unsigned, but hinting at some scandal involving the postmaster's cousin. You don't think it's another mystery, do you?" Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea for her friend. "Oh, Dolly, there's always a mystery in St. Mary Mead, if one looks closely enough. But let's not leap to conclusions. A letter in a donation box could be nothing more than idle gossip, or it could be something more. Shall we have a scone and consider?"
Mrs. Bantry laughed, settling into a chair, You're incorrigible, Jane. But tell me, how did you do it? How did you see through all those lies at Marwood Hall? I've been telling everyone at the Women's Institute about your triumph, and they're all agog." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she handed her friend a cup of tea. "It's no great secret, my dear. People are much the same, whether in a grand house or a village cottage. They hide their fears, their grudges, their hopes, but they leave traces, small things like a dropped cufflink or a nervous glance. You simply have to watch and listen and trust that the truth will show itself." As they chatted, the afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the floor. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the brass key, the notebook, and the note marked "Traitor." Small details that had unravelled a murder. She wondered about the letter in the church donation box, its contents as yet unknown. Was it a harmless bit of village intrigue, or the first thread of a new puzzle? Either way, she was ready, her sharp mind and quiet patience ever at the ready to untangle the complexities of the human heart. The roses outside her window swayed gently in the breeze, and Miss Marple smiled. Life in St. Mary Mead might seem simple, but it was never dull. Not for someone who saw the world as a tapestry of secrets, waiting to be woven into truth. Chapter 15. The New Thread. The golden light of late summer lingered over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a warm glow that belied the hint of autumn in the air. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, her knitting needles moving with their steady, soothing rhythm. The roses, meticulously tended, bloomed vibrantly, their petals a quiet testament to her care. Yet her mind was not entirely at rest. The mysterious letter mentioned by Mrs. Bantry, found in the church donation box, had stirred her curiosity, its faint echo of intrigue reminiscent of the secrets that had unravelled at Marwood Hall. The village, with its familiar faces and routines, seemed unchanged on the surface. But Miss Marple knew better than most that even the quietest places held their secrets. The letter, as Mrs. Bantry had described it, was unsigned and cryptic, hinting at a scandal involving the postmaster's cousin, a young man named Thomas Reed, who had recently returned to St. Mary Mead after a stint in London. The whispers in the village were vague, something about unpaid debts and a mysterious benefactor, but Miss Marple sensed there was more to the story, a thread waiting to be pulled. As she sipped her tea, her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of young Lee.
"Send me to tell you, the vicar's found another letter in the donation box, just this morning. It's ever so strange, and he's in a right tizzy about it." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her interest piqued. "Another letter, you say? And what does this one contain, my dear?" Lucy hesitated, glancing around as if the roses themselves might eavesdrop. "It's like the first one, Auntie says. Unsigned, with odd words. This one mentioned a debt repaid in shadows, and something about a meeting at the old mill tonight. The vicar's worried it's trouble, but he doesn't want to go to the police just yet." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her smile remained gentle. "A debt repaid in shadows," she murmured. "How curious. And does the letter mention Mr. Reed by name?" "Not exactly," Lucy admitted, "but everyone's saying it's about him. What with the first letter and all, Auntie thought you might know what to make of it, seeing as you're so clever with these things." Miss Marple chuckled softly, patting Lucy's hand. "You're very kind to say so, Lucy. Tell your aunt I'll pop by the vicarage later to have a look. In the meantime, don't spread the word too widely. Gossip has a way of muddying the truth." As Lucy scampered off, Miss Marple's mind began to weave a new pattern. The phrase, "a debt repaid in shadows,"
echoed the anonymous letters at Marwood Hall, particularly the one mentioning a debt of honor. Was it coincidence, or was there a connection? Thomas Reed, she recalled, was a quiet young man, prone to keeping to himself, but his time in London had left him with a certain air of secrecy. She made a mental note to visit the post office later, where she might glean more from Mrs. Reed, the postmaster's wife, who was known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. The afternoon passed quietly, with Miss Marple tending to her garden and reflecting on the parallels between her recent adventure and this new mystery. At Marwood Hall, it had been the small details, a key, a note, a trembling hand, that had led her to Dr. Gray's guilt. Here, in St. Mary Mead, she suspected the same attention to detail would be needed. She decided to attend the Women's Institute meeting that evening, where the village's gossip would flow freely, offering clues disguised as idle chatter. At the meeting, held in the church hall, the air buzzed with speculation about the letters. Mrs. Bantry, ever the enthusiastic storyteller, regaled the group with a slightly embellished version of Miss Marple's triumph at Marwood Hall, much to the old lady's amusement. But it was Mrs. Reed's nervous demeanour that caught Miss Marple's attention. The postmaster's wife, usually voluble, was unusually subdued, her eyes darting to the door whenever someone entered. During a lull in the conversation, Miss Marple approached her, her tone gentle. "Mrs. Reed, I hear there's been some exciting church with these letters. Have you heard anything about your cousin Thomas that might shed light on the matter?" Mrs. Reed's hands twisted in her apron, her voice low. "Oh, Miss Marple, I don't know what to think. Thomas has been odd since he came back from London. Secretive, always slipping off to meet someone. He says it's business, but I found a note in his coat pocket last week, all strange-like, about settling accounts at the old mill. I didn't tell anyone, but now with these letters—" Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the information. "Thank you, Mrs. Reed. It's probably nothing, but I'll keep an eye out. The old mill, you say? A curious place for business." As she left the hall, Miss Marple resolved to take a quiet stroll by the old mill that evening, a curiosity now fully aroused. The mill, long abandoned, was a place of shadows and whispers, perfect for clandestine meetings. She would go alone, armed only with her sharp wits and her unerring sense of human nature. The echoes of Marwood Hall lingered, but this new thread promised a mystery all its own, and Miss Marple was ready to unravel it, stitch by careful stitch.